the dead, buried and cremated talks on climate change. We'll talk to Liberal MP Tim Wilson. Thanks very much for your company.
Thanks, Peter, and that was an absolutely ridiculous package.
Yes, well, there you go. I kind of said the same thing. So let's move on from that. You know, a little bit of lightheartedness ahead of a serious interview like this is no bad thing. Let's get into what's going on with Duncan Lewis. Who's right, who's wrong? Is George Brandison and Peter Dutton, are they right? Or is Tony Abbott right in what he says about Duncan Lewis's comments?
Well, everybody's getting their knickers in a twist for nothing, frankly. I mean, it depends on where you put the emphasis on words. Have there been refugees in the past who have ended up going on to commit terrorist acts? The answer is yes. It's a very small number. If you then go in and say, is there a link, which was, I think, the original question, meaning a causal relationship between people being refugees and people committing terrorist acts, the answer is resolutely no. And so that is the honest assessment of the situation, and that's how it should be resolved.
How does that work, though? I mean, look, you know, I would have thought, how can you say there's no causal link if the very people who have committed terrorist acts are by definition refugees? You're just saying that that's an ancillary coincidence? Is that the point?
Well, the point is that the vast majority of people who engage in terrorist acts is because they've been radicalised. It's got, you know, very little to do with the fact that they're refugees. And, you know, if you want to draw and establish a causal relationship, which is this is the number of refugees have, this is the rate of terrorism incidents, it's just not accurate, not an accurate reflection. Whereas if you say and acknowledge that there have been some people in the past who have then gone on to commit terrorist acts, you can, but it's a very small percentage, and it's not this causal relationship.
But Tony Abbott is drawing the link implicitly and in some respects explicitly, whether we talk about his opinion piece today or some of his comments on radio yesterday. You'd have to acknowledge that.
Well, but if you acknowledge that there has been problems, and I've no doubt there may be problems into the future, then you're being intellectually honest. But you're also being intellectually honest if you say that the relationship is anecdotal at best in comparison to people being radicalised, people being born in their own country and being radicalised, or even people who come to Australia and then being radicalised.
But Tony Abbott is suggesting that Duncan Lewis should think about the way he words what he said. Do you agree with him?
Well, I've just given a different answer to Duncan Lewis, which reflects an honest assessment. I'm sure he'd be pretty relaxed about saying the same thing. So I think he read into it something different to perhaps what Senator Hanson was implying, and that's why you're getting this inconsistency.
Do you think that perhaps he was aware?
Do
you think he was perhaps aware of what Senator Hanson was trying to suggest, and he was therefore trying to stop that, and perhaps therefore this sort of furor started around the wording?
You'd have to ask him that question, but I think he was trying to have an honest assessment about exactly what I just outlined, and I think there's just a different emphasis, and as I said, everybody's getting a knickers in a knot for no reason.
Margaret Court has doubled down on some comments that she's made previously about same-sex marriage, become much more pointed, bringing Hitler into the equation, as well as some other comments on the way through. What do you make of her stance on this? What does it tell us about how incredibly, you know, sort of nice and highbrow debates around a plebiscite might have been?
Well, you know, I'm somebody who believes in Godwin's law, which is once you invoke the Nazis as a justification, unless it's explicitly justified, it means you've probably lost the argument. What we know is that a vast majority of the Australian population either supports a change in the law or, frankly, just doesn't care. And it's one of those issues that I said the other day is descended almost into national silliness, where we get some people who care passionately on both sides taking more and more extreme positions, and this is a kind of debate that we're left with. Frankly, I think Margaret Court's comments should be ignored and not even be validated.
But that sort of commentary would be more likely to get more of an airing during a plebiscite debate, wouldn't it?
Oh, yes and no, but you can have a choice about acknowledging it, giving it oxygen, trying to somehow legitimise a discussion around mind control techniques and attitudes around an issue like marriage for same-sex couples. Most Australians approach this issue, I think, from the same position. They know people who are in committed relationships who want to get married. They go, fair enough, they're not particularly engaged. They want the issue to be dealt with in its appropriate way, and then, frankly, for the country to move on.
The foreign editor for The Australian, Greg Sheridan, has an opinion piece in the paper today, headlined, "Liberals must join Barnaby Joyce's Uluru rejection." The subheading saying that the misguided proposals of the Aboriginal leadership risk fracturing Australian society. Do you agree with him?
Well, I don't agree with such a strong statement as that. I've said things already on Sky and to the Australian newspaper talking about what will work out of Uluru and what won't. You know, the statement out of Uluru was a statement from the heart. It reflected the genuine and sincere ambitions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to be heard about the issues that affect them and have pathways to deal with settlements of issues unresolved in the past. And I think the ambition behind it and why they want those issues resolved is right. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with the way that it's been put forward, but I'm somebody who tries to listen to the problems and then look at how we can solve them rather than just saying no straight down the line.
Do you want Indigenous recognition within the Constitution? Do you think that's a good move?
Well, I've said already on the public record that I think there's space to look at how we can use minor amendments to the Constitution to repeal the race power, which I'm supportive of because I believe in equality before the law, but also how you can use any change to drive improvements in communities. Because the problem Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders face in Australia is not in Canberra, it's in communities, and how we can use this debate to improve communities taking responsibility for themselves, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders having the freedom to take responsibility for their lives and drive human outcomes.
All right, let's move to another topic, the Paris Accord. It looks like Donald Trump's going to ensure that it's dead, buried and cremated. Is there any point in it if the US pull out?
Well, the reality, it's kind of odd because the Paris agreement was one that the left traditionally railed against, who are all suddenly now big spruikers and defenders of it. They oppose it basically because it's just a series of commitments of ambitions about cutting emissions. What actually matters is what happens in countries. Australia is going to continue to cut its emissions. It's going to continue to work towards building up energy security while also doing it with a smaller emissions footprint. That's what matters, not what's in international treaties.
OK, sure, but if Donald Trump pulls out, that does have a profound impact on even these country-by-country commitments, doesn't it?
I don't think so, because most of the countries heading in that direction are doing so for domestic policy like we are. We have a sovereign risk problem now around energy security and people making investments, particularly in fossil fuels. So the market is responding to that. And the government is responding to that to make sure that we have baseload affordable energy to meet the demand of Australian industry and households. That's completely disconnected from what's in international treaties. There's a relationship there, but it's not explicit. What matters is what decisions our government is making, and the Turnbull government is making decisions to make sure that we can deliver affordable energy and secure energy for Australians and their businesses. Just
before we run out of time, the Treasurer, Scott Morrison, he enjoys powerful rhetoric. He delivered powerful rhetoric against people smugglers, and now he's delivering it against bank CEOs. Do you think that he's delivering similar attacks to both? I mean, it strikes me that you're almost a higher grade if you're a people smuggler than if you're a bank CEO with the way that he's going after them now.
Well, I wouldn't draw that analogy. I mean, the reality is the Treasurer is somebody of man of conviction and prepared to stand up for what he believes in. And when he gets pushed back, he'll push back in turn. So what we know is people smugglers are criminals. Bank CEOs and banks are businesses that engage in the economy.
Well, hang on. He's accusing them of exploiting their market power to the detriment of everyday Australians. There's got to be some criminality in that, doesn't there? If there's not, why not? You guys write the laws.
You know as well as I do there's no criminality. He's not making that allegation of criminality, but he is saying that there's a basis he believes very strongly for the bank levy to make sure that there is more competition in the market by making sure that it only applies to the larger banks and not to the smaller ones to give them a competitive edge.
But I just read it on the front page of the Financial Review. Scott Morrison's extraordinary claim, the four big banks are exploiting their market power to the detriment of everyday Australians, is testament to the confusion over policy for the financial system and the broader economy. It is what he's saying, isn't it? Or is the AFR just making it up?
No. Well, they're not doing even what you're doing, which is accusing him of accusing the banks of criminality. What he's saying is that some of the banks aren't in touch with Australians, and I actually agree with that sentiment. They've behaved in an arrogant manner in the past.
Hang on. All I'm doing is saying, if that's what they're doing, you guys make the law. Why don't you make it a criminal offence to abuse your market power to the detriment of everyday Australians? People like you and me.
Well, I don't think... Well, I don't think that they're necessarily abusing their market power, but what they are trying to do is make sure that they deliver services to the Australian population so that people can buy houses, build their life and opportunity. And are they seeking an advantage considering they can borrow capital cheaper than smaller banks? Of course they are. And we've got to recognise that we have to have a competitive market environment.
Tim Wilson, always appreciate you joining us on Newsday. Thanks once again.
Thanks, Peter. You take care.